Pam Bondi's Courtroom Showdown. A judge's challenge turned constitutional battle asterisk asterisk. Judge Prescott thought a simple fine would silence Pam Bondi. He never expected her to dismantle his entire argument in front of the courtroom. The Tampa courthouse had seen its fair share of legal battles. But on this particular morning, no one could have predicted the storm that was about to unfold. Pam Bondi, sharp as ever, stepped through the heavy wooden doors, a briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting the lapel of her blazer. She was here for what should have been a routine hearing, one she could argue in her sleep. But as she made her way to the defendant's table, she felt the judge's gaze settle on her before he even spoke. Judge Prescott, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were locked on something just below her collarbone, a simple gold cross. The air in the courtroom shifted, a quiet stillness settling over the room. Then, in a tone as sharp as a gavel strike, Prescott cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Miss Bondi, I must remind you that religious symbols have no place in my courtroom." Pam barely blinked. "Your Honor, you're fining me for wearing a cross?" Prescott's expression remained unreadable. "It violates the neutrality of this space. Remove it or face a fine." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk darted a glance between the judge and Pam. It wasn't the first time a judge had tried to assert control in an unusual way. But finding a lawyer over a necklace? That was new. Pam didn't move. "Your Honor, my cross is no different than a wedding ring or a locket with a family photo inside." Prescott sighed, already growing impatient. "That's not how I see it. Either remove it or I'll issue the fine." For the first time in her career, Pam Bondi found herself fined, not for misconduct, not for a procedural violation, but for wearing a piece of jewelry. The fine wasn't the issue. It was what it represented. She folded her hands over her briefcase, her expression cool. She wasn't about to let this go. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to address this issue formally." Prescott raised a brow. "Address it? This hearing is about a business dispute, not your personal grievances." Pam didn't flinch. "I'm also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a recess for personal opinions." That got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. The court reporter's fingers hovered over a keyboard. The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't about a legal contract anymore. This was a constitutional challenge. Pam reached into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue. She was about to dismantle his entire premise. "Your Honor, what legal precedent are you basing this fine on?" Silence. Prescott exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Ms. Bondi." Pam nodded. "It does, but that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper in front of her. "Under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected, especially when it does not disrupt proceedings." Prescott scoffed. "You're an attorney, not a law professor." Pam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then let's talk case law, shall we?" She picked up the paper. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A landmark case establishing that individuals do not shed their constitutional rights when they enter a government institution, whether that is school or a courtroom. Prescott's jaw tightened slightly. He knew that case. Every lawyer did. Pam didn't stop. West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943. The Supreme Court ruled that compelling individuals to remove or hide symbols of personal belief is a violation of their First Amendment rights. She set the paper down. "Now, Your Honor, would you like me to keep going, or would you prefer to reconsider that fine?" A long pause. The judge's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. He was cornered, and he knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him concede. "Not yet. This is not a religious debate, Ms. Bondi." Pam tilted her head. "Then why did you make it one?" A few quiet gasps broke out in the courtroom. Prescott's face darkened. Pam leaned forward. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll stop when I receive a legal justification for this fine, because so far I haven't heard one." Another long pause. Then finally, Prescott looked at the clerk. "Mark the fine as pending review." Pam smirked. "I'll take that as a temporary victory." But she wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. She had sent a message, loud and clear, one that Prescott wouldn't forget anytime soon. The fallout? That was only just beginning. The silence was deafening. Pam calmly adjusted her blazer, the small gold cross still in place, exactly where it had been the entire time. She had won, but now she had to ensure this wasn't just a personal victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, a middle-aged business owner, the actual reason for this hearing. The man met her gaze with barely concealed nod of respect, his confidence in her only growing stronger. Pam knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter, one who'd been covering an entirely different case in the same building, caught wind of what had just unfolded. Within an hour, a local news site posted the headline, "Florida judge attempts to find attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned." Pam's phone buzzed. Then again, and again. Colleagues, former law school classmates, journalists, people wanted to know what had just happened, but Pam wasn't interested in headlines or media spins. She had a bigger picture in mind. Her next step? Taking this beyond a courtroom skirmish. She wasn't naive. Cases like this had ripple effects, whether she intended them to or not. This wasn't just about a single judge or a single attorney. This was a challenge to a precedent that hadn't been set, but very well could be. Would other judges attempt something similar? Would attorneys feel pressured to leave their personal symbols at home to avoid confrontation? Would this moment embolden others to push the boundaries of courtroom neutrality in ways that targeted personal beliefs? Pam wasn't going to let that happen. The story takes on a life of its own. By that evening, the story had already spread. A well-known legal commentator on a conservative news station brought it up during a panel discussion. Social media exploded with heated debates, some supporting the judge's stance, others seeing Pam's defiance as a critical stand for constitutional rights. Pam sat in her office, watching the discussion unfold on her phone. A producer from a national news network had already reached out, requesting an interview. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. She had spent years fighting for clients, standing her ground in high-stakes cases. But this was different. This wasn't about corporate disputes or criminal defense. This was about personal freedoms, and whether they could be stripped away at the whim of a single judge. And Prescott? He wasn't done with her yet. Even as she left the courthouse that day, she sensed it. The way he had looked at her before banging the gavel and dismissing the session. He might have rescinded the fine, but there had been something in his expression, an unspoken challenge. Pam wasn't sure what form it would take, but she knew this battle was far from over. Retaliation begins. Pam expected some fallout, maybe a few emails, a couple phone calls from colleagues weighing in. What she hadn't expected was the sheer speed at which everything escalated. By the time she walked into her office the next morning, her assistant, Lauren, was already waiting, a concerned expression on her face. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her tablet. Pam took it, scanning the screen. The Florida Bar Association had just issued a statement. Carefully worded, neutral in tone, but unmistakable in its implications. Judges have the right to maintain decorum in their courtrooms. While attorneys are afforded personal expression, it is important to respect the roles set forth by presiding judges. We trust our judicial system to navigate these matters with fairness and integrity. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a comment. It was a warning. The words "respect the rules set forth by presiding judges" weren't just a general statement. They were a signal. The legal world was tight-knit, and the Florida bar rarely commented on courtroom disputes unless they had reason to believe a situation was spiraling out of control. This meant Prescott wasn't just bitter. He was working behind the scenes, rallying institutional backing. Pam set the tablet down. "This came out today?" Lauren nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. The legal community was small. Word had traveled fast. And Prescott clearly wasn't taking this lightly. But before she could say another word, Lauren hesitated. "There's more." Pam glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Lauren handed her another document, this one printed. Pam skimmed the first few lines, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. Attorney Pamela Bondi conducted herself in a manner that disrupted courtroom proceedings, challenged judicial authority inappropriately, and engaged in behavior unbecoming of an office of court. Pam couldn't help it. She let out a short, humorless laugh. Unbecoming? That's rich. Lauren sighed. It's retaliation. Pure and simple. Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest. Prescott wasn't just looking for payback. He was trying to set an example. He had lost in his own courtroom, and now he was using the system to reassert his power. By filing this formal complaint, he was trying to flip the narrative. No longer the judge who overstepped his authority. Now, he was the one who had been disrespected. And Pam? He wanted to paint her as the reckless attorney who had challenged him just for the sake of challenging him. She had seen this move before. It was a classic tactic. Turn the accuser into the accused, reframe the story, bury the real issue under bureaucracy and technicalities. But she wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process on this?" she asked, already shifting gears. Lauren exhaled. "You have 10 days to respond. If the complaint moves forward, they could conduct a formal review." Pam nodded slowly. "And who oversees that review?" Lauren hesitated. "A panel that includes judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Prescott was hoping to bury her in paperwork and quiet pressure, he had miscalculated. Because this wasn't going to be handled behind closed doors. This was about to become very public. The fight goes public. Pam picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She knew how these things worked. Retaliation was most effective in the shadows. Prescott wanted to use the system against her while keeping the public in the dark. She wasn't about to let that happen. She pressed call. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you." It was Lisa Reynolds, a veteran journalist from a national legal affairs program. She had covered some of Pam's biggest cases before, and more importantly, she wasn't afraid to go after judicial overreach. Pam got straight to the point. "Lisa, I need you to listen carefully." By the next morning, the headlines had changed. Florida judge attempt to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's under fire. And Prescott? He was officially on the defensive. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee. The message was clear. Never let someone in power strip away your rights without a fight. Because sometimes all it takes is one person standing their ground to change everything.